Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Today we're just going to talk about threat intelligence and how to use it, and use it in a way that kind of you can take back to your organization today and make changes that improve your detections, improve your operationalizing of it, right? So before we get started, just going to go over a high-level agenda of what we're talking about. So first, we'll just talk about who I am and why you should listen to me, right? Hopefully you get something from that, think you should talk and listen to me, that's great. We'll talk about what threat intelligence actually is. So we'll establish a foundational level of what threat intelligence is, just so that we're all on the same language, right? And we can also build upon those concepts later on in the talk, right? So moving after that, we'll talk about the shortcomings of the current model. So we'll talk about some situations that I've experienced personally and that I've seen, or anecdotes that I've heard, right, about situations where threat intel could have been leveraged in a better way and maybe was used inappropriately that resulted in some sort of bad actions taken by a SOC analyst. Moving after that, we'll talk about how to fix that issue. So we'll talk about the issue, right, but we'll also bring back something to you so you can actually improve your threat detection with threat intelligence. And lastly, we'll talk about leadership's role. So leadership isn't safe in this scenario, right? We're going to talk about them too. We're going to focus a lot about SOC analysts, but leadership, top-down leadership will definitely affect how your threat intelligence is consumed in your organization, and we'll talk about why that is so important. So who am I? Like Ray said in the introduction, my name is Burke. I'm a security consultant at Mandiant, but I'm also an instructor at the University of Houston. I'm a consumer of threat intelligence for over 5 years. That's just a fancy way to say that I've been doing SOC analyst-related work for 5 years or so. I'm in a unique position at Mandiant because I, for one, have sort of a strategic guidance that I can provide customers to improve their security posture, but I'm also on the front lines analyzing alerts and actually actioning items in the SIEM or whatever network appliance the client is actually using. So I get the unique perspective of looking at the whole approach of threat intel, which we'll talk about in the next slide here, the three-tiered layer of threat intel. I get to look at it from every single perspective. So I got a unique take on it, right? This is a fun fact about me. I kickstart board games for fun. And me being a nerd, that's not really that impressive, right? Everybody likes board games if you're a nerd. But so what I do to make myself different is I kickstart them. So I'll pour a glass of red wine late at night. I'll go on my laptop and look at all these board games on Kickstarter. And if you're not familiar with Kickstarter, it's a crowdsourcing, application where you can just guarantee or just pledge money to an idea. And if the idea gets enough money, they'll actually make the item, the product that you actually kickstart. And so what I do is I'll kickstart whatever, and then a year or two later, when it gets delivered at my doorstep, it's kind of like my birthday on February or July or whatever, right? So that's a little bit about me. So we'll move right into the good stuff, the topics, right? The threat intel stuff. So according to CrowdStrike, this is their sweet definition of this. In short, it's just data that is collected about attackers in a way to develop some sort of idea of what their motives are, what the tactics are going to use, and some of the strategies behind their attack behaviors. Typically when we talk about, if this will work, wait for it. Great. Okay. When we talk about threat intel, I mentioned the pyramid, right? The different layered approach of threat intel. We typically operate at a strategic, operational, and tactical level. So from a strategic perspective, we're talking about the high-level trends of an attacker. So these are things like we have an election going on, so we can expect foreign adversaries to try to attack us, right? Understanding that methodology from a higher level is extremely important. For a SOC analyst, for a blue teamer, we're not too concerned about that. That's more of the high-level security decision makers, the threat intel analyst who consumes that sort of data and socializes that in a way that the upper management can understand. That's where they operate at the strategic level. This talk will focus mostly on operational and tactical. So the operational level is going to be the TTPs that an attacker leverages, the tactics, techniques, procedures that an adversary leverages. So these are things like they deliver a malicious phishing email. After a user gives out credentials, the attacker will then leverage O365 in some specific way. We can map that out to a specific attacker. That's the methodology that the attacker will use. That's operating at a operational level. And lastly, tactical level, which is what most people think about when they think threat intelligence. These are just raw IPv4 addresses, hashes, email addresses, just raw IOCs, indicators of compromise. So that could be news to some people. Some people just assume all intelligence is enrich this IP address, let me know where it came from and who it's attributed to, what APT group or whatever, right? But it's actually a lot more than that. It's not just IOCs. So I said OIC a few times. If you're not familiar with that, an IOC is just an artifact that indicates a computer intrusion of some sort happened or potentially happened. So we typically operate with the 3 categories of IOCs, though you might see the first 2, atomic and computed, kind of put together, smashed together. Really not that important to differentiate it, but for this talk we will. So atomic IOCs are just what you probably think about when you think threat intelligence. Email addresses, host names, IP addresses, things of that nature. It's sort of like an atom to matter on Earth, right? An atom is the smallest component. Atomic indicators rather are the smallest component of intelligence. After that, we have computed, which is going to be the actual hashes of your malware. Some sort of computation needs to happen to derive some sort of value out of the intelligence. I put regular expressions up there. You don't really see that too often. That's in regards to like complicated regex or some sort of computation needs to happen to make this value, to make an IOC. But for the most part, we just think of it as hashes. So a hash of a piece of malware is a computed IOC. And lastly, we have behavioral, which is just some sort of suspicious web traffic to a malicious domain. That's just a behavior that's weird. That is an IOC in its own right. The malicious domain is an atomic IOC, but the activity itself is a behavioral IOC. And then lastly, the user logon. A user logon from an unknown, uncommon geographic region, that's an IOC in itself. That is a behavioral IOC. So this is a quick thought exercise before we wrap it up on the introduction threat intel portion. So I have 2 examples here, and I would like for you to think about what is the highest fidelity out of these 2 examples? Which is the alert that sticks out to you the most, that makes you think, oh wow, I need to action this like relatively quickly, right? So the first one is we have scan traffic hitting your web server, looking for a vulnerability from a specific IP that is a known IP to some sort of APT group, right? The second one is going to be a phishing email with an attachment whose hash has been known to be associated with another APT group. So I'll give you about 10 seconds, I'll get some water, and then we'll talk about which one is the best one. All right, so, oops, don't step on that. So the best indicator, the best alert out of these 2 is going to be the bottom one here. We'll talk about why, right? So scan traffic, welcome to the internet, right? It's gonna happen to everybody. Pretty normal. Yeah, a specific vulnerability, maybe it's just some sort of new exchange vulnerability that came out that literally the whole entire world is scanning for. Not a big deal. A specific IP, that's a little more interesting, but how useful is a static IP address when it comes to intelligence? We'll talk about why that's really not that useful. When it comes to the second choice here, we have a computated indicator, which is a hash, right, from a phishing email. So I don't know about you, but I don't really receive executables in email anymore. I don't really receive these raw malicious payloads in email anymore. Usually it's going to be a credential harvesting website, maybe a PDF, which leads to a credential harvesting website. You don't really see raw bad hashes, bad attachments getting delivered because even your Gmail, even your Yahoo has some sort of email security in some way. That's going to prevent a lot of this from happening. So if I see this successfully get delivered and there's an attachment that has a hash that's known with this group, I might be getting targeted specifically, right? That's probably bad. So I would want to jump on this immediately and see what's the blast radius, who else received this email, did they click on it, did they download it, whatever it might be, I might actually just want to do some more triage on that. So the pillar that this will operate under is going to be the tactical intelligence pillar we were talking about earlier. These are just IOCs, hashes, IP addresses, domain names, things of that nature. The next example is more of a behavioral standpoint. So we're talking about an attacker will get an initial foothold. They'll use PowerShell to download more tools. Maybe they download, I don't know, PowerSploit and keep on with their attack path, right? Shortly after, they'll create a password on a new host, or create a new user rather, create a new password with a specifically defined password, let me in 123, and then they will begin moving around your network, continuing along the attack path. That is more of a operational perspective. We're talking about these specific TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures that an attacker will take. Rather than just this email address, this hash, we're talking they do this, they do that, and then after that, they do this, right? So it's very different ball game, but it's extremely important to harmonize both operational and tactical to get the best value out of your threat intelligence. So that's the introduction part. Excuse me. We talked about the basics of threat intelligence, and now we should all be talking on a relatively common ground, right? So let's go ahead and build upon that. So the current state of threat intelligence can be described in 3 memes that I found. I just typed in threat intel memes on Google, and these 3 were pretty sufficient in the point I want to get across, right? So the first one here is we don't just dump indicators in production. There should be a whole process where we analyze the indicators we get. We provide feedback to the actual Intel subscription, whatever vendor it might be, but we need to make sure that the indicators are relevant to us. Do I care about, like if I'm in the oil and gas industry, do I care about biomed devices necessarily? Vulnerabilities with devices that I'm not leveraging? Probably not. Do I want to put that into production? Probably not, right? We need to vet that stuff. The second one here, that's more focused on attribution. That's outside the scope of this talk. We're not talking about attribution necessarily. That deserves a whole day of conversation because it's so difficult and so theoretical. But the point I want to get across is something like a static IPv4 address, is that good enough for attribution? Probably not, right? We need to do more than that. We need to do a lot more analysis, understand the behaviors that followed leveraging this IP address. Let's do more. So we need to dive deeper. We can't just say, oh, this is a Russian IP address. We were attacked by some APT group from Russia. Probably not. Maybe, right? But probably not. Let's do more analysis on that. And the last one here is threat intelligence isn't just indicators, right? In the very beginning, I said at that tactical level, we kind of just assume Intel is IP addresses, hashes, things of that nature. But it's a lot more than that. We need to use the operational pillar of threat intelligence to understand, okay, well, a user beaconed out to a known malicious domain. Did they have any endpoint activity that I can associate with that IP address from any sort of Intel report? Am I looking for PowerShell? Am I looking for cmd.exe being executed by WinWord for some reason? Do more analysis, right? So we're not doing this currently. Some people are, of course, but currently in the state that we're in, we just assume a lot without really using context to derive the true meaning behind some of this intel that we're leveraging. So this is the ideal threat intelligence lifecycle. This is the model that we want to follow. Of course, we're not doing that, and we'll talk about what we're actually doing in the next slide. But I mentioned leadership in the beginning. At the very top, you see planning and direction. That happens at a leadership level. Leadership needs to enable threat intelligence, right? Us as SOC analysts, blue teamers, we can do what we can, but if we're not the ones driving the decisions, we can try to influence it, but if we don't have the keys to actually drive, then we need to make sure that leadership at a higher level understands what threat intelligence is and how to actually leverage that across your security stack. If I'm buying threat intelligence that doesn't integrate with my AV product, how useful is that intelligence, right? So we need to make sure we're all on the same page on the planning and direction phase. After that planning and direction phase, it typically moves into collection. That is just the raw gathering of the intel. This is acquiring your licenses, your API keys, whatever it might be. If you have a honeypot, that can be even you doing it, if you're good enough to do that and use that in a way to enhance your organization's threat intelligence. Shortly after that, we have the analysis phase. So this is actually vetting the indicators. Are these indicators useful for me? I need to figure that out. So I need to actually understand what they're giving me, make reason of it, and actually either give feedback to the organization, give feedback to whoever captured that intel, and say, hey, this isn't useful for us. This isn't going to be helpful. I can't action this in some way. Shortly after that, we have the production stage. That is actually just simply push it out. Integrate it with your network security products, your AV products, your SIM product, whatever it might be, push it out there, right? Let's push it into production. Now that we did the vetting, right, we did our analysis portion, let's push it out and make sure that we're actually generating some value out of that threat intelligence subscription. And my favorite part, and for me the most important, is the feedback. If there's no feedback loop, where does my feedback go? This indicator sucks. Who do I tell? If there's nobody to tell, then I'm just firing alerts that I don't care about, right? And that's an issue too. That's a whole other issue when we come to SOC burnout, where if I'm just actioning alerts that I don't care about, that's not good. So we need to make sure there's a feedback loop. Either that comes with feedback loop to upper management within your organization, or it comes to a feedback loop with your vendor. I need to be able to communicate to both, ideally, right? But if you can only choose one, I mean, you got to play with the hand you're dealt, right? So make sure there's a communication loop, there's a feedback loop that's closed, that you can actually get this full circle. And it's a circle for a reason. It's continuous. It's a continuous update. So just because you got to the feedback portion, it's not over, right? We're continually fighting that fight. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a fight. That's probably not the best verbiage, but the communication only needs to be flowing to improve the whole entire process continuously. So this is the reality of what we have. You see analysis is gone, and feedback is gone, and now we have this cute, sad analyst, right? So this is what happens most often. So we have leadership maybe who doesn't really understand the purpose behind threat intelligence. They just know they need to buy something. Lower level people may be telling them, Mandiant has the best threat intelligence, right? Or whoever it might be, might have the best threat intelligence. And they just go, okay, write a check, here you go, boom, done, right? We collect it, we just gather the data. We don't analyze it. Is it relevant to us? I don't know. Put it into production now. Just throw it in there, see what fires, right? And what happens is the analyst that's working these alerts sees the same IOC fire 10, 20, 30 times in a day. And guess what? Next time I see it, I'm going to ignore it, right? It's just inherent. We're all human, right? When we see the same thing over and over again, we stop caring. And so the issue with that is what if the next one that fires is real? It's a real alert, a real IOC that actually had something of value that happened in your organization. If I'm just ignoring it, what are the chances of me actually picking that alert out and making sure I triage it appropriately? Probably not, right? So that's one of the main contributions to SOC burnout, is just actioning alerts that we don't care about. And if you see, there's no more feedback. So now this analyst is sad because he can't talk to anybody. He can't talk about his feelings, right? He can't say, this alert sucks. I don't want to use this anymore. We need to tune it. So one of the biggest drawbacks is just simply that. There's no feedback, which is why it's my favorite portion of this whole entire circle, is we need feedback. We need to be able to talk to somebody about the issues that we're facing with this threat intelligence that we're trying to leverage. So I pose the question, are all indicators good indicators? And the answer to that is maybe, yes, no, depends. It all depends, right? Context is extremely important to whatever we're using when it comes to intelligence. So I make the point here, atomic indicators are static, meaning they are what they are. So an IP address, is that a valid indicator? Yes. Is it an important one? Potentially. But how often can IP addresses change, from vendor to vendor or company to company? Or if you're talking about AWS, right, with elastic IPs, this IP might be leased to some client for 2 days, and the next day it goes somewhere else. So how valuable is that piece of intel, right? In fact, I had a client one time who was leveraging a new SIM platform, and we were helping them onboard some of their threat intel products, right? And they were leveraging they enabled the threat intel that was built in to the SIM, which I'm a little bit nervous when I hear that, because these SIM vendors who want to inherently have intelligence, I don't really trust as much. I trust the people that have products that are at the edge of the networks, seeing the traffic go by, creating telemetry, your AV vendors who are able to have access to several different types of endpoints across the world. Those are higher fidelity in my opinion, whereas a SIM is just a data lake, it's a repository. So do I trust their intel as much? Probably not. I'm sure they have guys that are smart people that are doing this stuff, right? But at scale, I'm just a little bit worried when I see that. So this client was using this platform and using this threat intel subscription that was baked in. And the subscription, all it was a static list of IPv4 addresses that said, if any firewall logs or proxy logs are found in this IP address context table, then you have cryptocurrency mining on your network. And so as soon as we enabled that, or it was already enabled when I got there actually, as soon as it was enabled, they started firing a bunch of alerts, 10, 20, 30 alerts, all from the same small region within their actual building. And so there were, hairs on fire, oh my God, what's happening? You got to sit them down, give them water and talk to them, make sure everything's okay, we're fine. When you do more analysis on this, you come to realize is that one of their SaaS vendors the client was leveraging hosted some sort of web application for them, right? And so this one portion of their building happened to use that vendor over and over again. They would log into that vendor. Well, every time they reached out to that vendor, it had an IP address that was allocated in that context table. So now, every single time one of their users reached out and did the normal work, they're firing alerts. So we had to quickly realize the issue with that and modify the context table. And honestly, I wanted to remove it completely, just that's me. But it wasn't good intel in that sense because this is just a static IP address, right? If I'm using a SaaS vendor who is hosting my web application for me, I bet you they have 1,000 clients that are also using that same exact IP address that they're hosting. So maybe one IP address in some way, some capacity has some sort of cryptocurrency mining on it, right? Maybe embedded into the web page. But the other 999 clients don't. So now you have a small indicator like an IPv4 address firing against 1,000 different websites, which that's not good, right? So we're going to create a lot of false positives that way. I posed the question, should a malicious IP address indicator from 2010 be ingested in your SIM? Maybe. It depends. We need to use context, right? If we're using a vendor who has a known issue, right, a known vulnerability, and that intel is baked into or we're using that intel, if we're still leveraging that vendor, we probably should have that intel still in our SIM, right? If we're not, get rid of it. We need to life cycle that data. The main point to drive home here is it's a process to life cycle as an intel provider, but also as a subscription like user. If you're using the intel, you also need to vet it. In fact, at a previous organization that I worked at, we had some sort of intel subscription as well that we were leveraging. And we were pretty much in the same boat as the vendor in the previous example where we just had a static list of IPv4 addresses. And it was for MageCart. And if you're not familiar with MageCart was a common thing that happened about 4 years ago, and it's probably still used now, for web skimming. So a user would input their payment stuff online, and MageCart had that website compromised. It would ship off a copy of that PCI information somewhere else for storage to sell, use later, and then the transaction would actually just go through like normal. It was completely abstracted from the user. They wouldn't really see that, but it happened. And so the vendor that I was working for had that information, and so they were able to create a huge IPv4 table and said, if anything happens, fire an alert to one of our customers and say, hey, you might have some sort of MageCart activity. The issue with that is we didn't life cycle that information, so maybe the first alert or the second alert or the third one was valid. But if the vendor was the owner of the website and they fixed it, and we're still firing alerts for activity based on that IP address, there's no more MageCart. So we're still firing alerts on it, right? That's not good. We need to have some sort of cycle that we're following to actually vet it and continuously improve upon it and not just say, we did it once, we did analysis once, we completed the cycle once, we're done. Let's do it more often, right? Let's continuously do it. So we talked about some issues, IP addresses, things of that nature not being that valid, context needed, things of that nature. We'll talk about the proper way to consume it. So in that example I gave where the SATA analyst showed up, analysis and dissemination and feedback were both missing, right? Easiest way is just fix that, right? Let's just improve upon that. Let's build out processes that actually, once we collect the intel we get, let's have some assigned folks who are actually going to analyze it and make sure it's going to work for what we need for our organization. So let's improve upon that. So once you get the analysis phase going, now we just need to put in the feedback stage, right? If there's no feedback loop, this is one of the easiest things to fix. There's several clients that I've been at where there's no, from what I observed, there's no feedback loop. All I do is go to Microsoft Forms, create a form, maybe 5 or 6 fields. What is the alert? What's the link to it? What's your beef with the alert? You know, how can we fix it? How can we improve it? And what can we potentially miss out on with whatever tuning you are suggesting? Super easy win. Looks good on us, right? Us as the client working for, the contractor working for the client. Looks good on us because now we have a brand new process that we developed and close that feedback loop. That's a quick win, real easy. And so now, after I put out that Microsoft form, whenever somebody submits something to it, it comes to my email. I have an auto forward rule that sends it out to my team. And now my team has a bi-weekly meeting or weekly, depending on the cadence needed, where we just talk about what are the tuning requests we got, how can we fix it, let's socialize that, let's communicate that to the upper leadership if we need to, and so on and so forth. Quick win, let's just fix the life cycle. Next is harmonizing operational and tactical together. We can't just split it up and say, oh, somebody beaconed to this IP address, we're done. We got an email from this sender that we're worried about, we're done. Let's see what happens after that. Okay, so now we got this email from a known bad sender. What's the next step? What do they do next? Okay, well, they want to get you to call them on the phone. After they call them on the phone, you download AnyDesk or whatever remote software for some reason. We can track that into the logs, right? We can see that in the log data that we get in our SIM. Let's actually map out the attack and not just say, one and done, we have an email, let's just triage it from there and remove it and call it a day. Let's actually follow the attack path and make sure we're catching every bit of it so we don't leave it behind any sort of artifacts that the attacker can leverage. Maybe they created a new account. If we just remove the email, they still have access, right? They can still remote into us because they have AnyDesk installed or whatever it might be. We need to catch that. And it's super important to harmonize the two so that we're not just operating out of the tactical portion or only the operational portion. Let's use both, right? And I put in bold context. One of the main things I want to drive home is context. If you're a SOC analyst, this should be pretty self-explanatory for you because you use context every day when you're actioning alerts. But it comes to be even more important when it comes to threat intelligence because context will drive all the conversation. Okay, so again, with operational, something happened. Was it a malicious server, was it a server that beaconed out to a malicious IP address, or was it a client? What is the difference? What is the response difference based upon that context, right? So different sort of scenarios need to be played out, and using context to kind of move or facilitate your actual response to the incident will be extremely important. So let's harmonize the both. Let's use both. This is also a quick win, hunting. Simple hunting with just something as simple as a computed hash. Doing enterprise sweeps across your environment, that's a quick win. That's an easy way. That's probably the most traditional way most people think of threat intelligence is just doing enterprise sweeps. If I can beacon out to all my EDR endpoints and actually say, okay, do you have this hash and this file path, then quick wins. Of course, any hits you get back from this, you need to verify, right? We talked about context. Verify that and make sure that it's malicious in fact. If one of these hashes, for whatever reason, is an AnyDesk, right? I keep using AnyDesk. If it's just AnyDesk, is that inherently evil? Depends, right? We need to validate that. Maybe our IT folks actually use it to remotely access other devices. Let's verify that. And again, there are cycles with that, and we will talk about how those cycles need to be leveraged. Next are actually writing detections. So building out detections. So Exabeam, one of the sweet vendors out there that gives you a bucket hat, which is great, you should get one, wrote a nice white paper about the print spooler or print nightmare vulnerability. And in that, they gave examples. You see here, detection case 1. They gave examples of actual actionable things you can do today to build detections using threat intelligence. So in this example, they said the spoolsv.exe parent process should never launch living off the land binaries, such as command.exe and PowerShell.exe. So you can just build a quick detection off of that. If I have a 4688 event, which is a process creation event, that had spoolsv as the parent process and the child process was PowerShell, give me an alert. So now we're not even using intelligence as a reactive measure, we're more being proactive about it because now we can find alerts and look for hits based on that. And so on this right document here, that's just the actual query that's leveraged to actually do it. When any event matches, give me an alert whenever the parent process is spoolsv.exe and the child process is PowerShell. Real quick win, real easy that we can do today. So we'll talk about UNC 2452 just as a case study of how we can use threat intelligence. So if you're not familiar with what an UNC group is, an UNC group is an uncategorized threat according to Mandiant, was FireEye, now Mandiant, right? Which if you see FireEye on these slides, just imagine it says Mandiant there, right? I didn't have enough time to change it, but just a few days ago, right? So UNC is just an uncategorized group, meaning we have our APTs, which is kind of like our college level threat actors, right? Like very high level, very whatever. UNC is more like your high school, so they haven't gotten there yet. So we have an aggregated amount of indicators. We haven't necessarily graduated it yet to the college level, so we're still calling it an UNC group. There could be several UNC groups that are tied into a single APT, for instance. Just use that context when we're talking about this. So according to Mandiant, UNC 2452 is the group that compromised SolarWinds and caused all that ruckus. So anybody else here have an issue in December whenever FireEye put out that report that SolarWinds was compromised? It was a big deal. Didn't make the holiday season too good because now everybody's chasing down these alerts, everybody's compromised, the world's gonna blow up, whatever. So one of the biggest IOCs to come out of that is that any sort of beaconing to this avsvmcloud.com with some sort of seemingly arbitrary prefix for the subdomain is malicious. So I will guarantee you that every single vendor out there that has a security product, not IAM focused, not password management focused, but every single vendor that's security focused did something, put out something. They had to say, hey, I acknowledge the fact that FireEye was compromised in some way. And now we're gonna build detections on that. So they pushed out telemetry all over the place. Every single one of your every single one of your products probably fired alerts within the week about quote unquote, sunburst or UNC 2452 activity. So with that, the vendors quickly built out telemetry, and now the analyst is kind of operating under a stressful situation, right? It's holiday season, and I have all these alerts coming at me. I'm kind of nervous, right? So with that quick win, a lot of the detections were DNS or web traffic. So I posed the question, should any traffic to this domain result in an incident response, right? I had a situation where a colleague of mine actually, I think it was like day 2 of the actual disclosure of the breach, just went to VirusTotal, typed in avsvmcloud.com, and within like 5 or 10 minutes, he said his internet access was cut off, right? So somebody on the enterprise security side saw that and was like, no, you are evil. I'm gonna quarantine your box. So he lost internet access immediately. Is that an appropriate step to take? Probably not, right? We need to derive more value out of that intel. Maybe let's look for context, right? Context. Let's use context for that. Okay, we see C2 traffic of some capacity. Maybe it's just web traffic, maybe it's VirusTotal, whatever. If I'm an enterprise analyst and I'm working a lot of these alerts, I might miss some of these things, like VirusTotal being the referrer or whatever, right? But I see something bad happen. Is this a client or is this a SolarWinds server? The initial infection vector was a SolarWinds server beaconing out to AVS-VM Cloud. So if I see a server doing it, then that's fair. Maybe let's action that a lot more quickly, right? Or a lot quicker rather. If I see a client doing it, it's possible. That's one of the C2 domains that was used even from a client perspective. But there's also like 20 other C2 domains that were also leveraged by clients whenever they were infected. So with it being a SolarWinds server, okay, that's not good. So then let's check for the actual malicious DLL that was pushed by UNC 2452. So if I can find that malicious DLL, okay, things are starting to add up. We're putting pieces together. We're kind of solving this scenario, right? That's going to drive our actual analysis for this alert. Was PowerShell launched as a child process to some sort of SolarWinds process? If I do see that, then I might think about, let's quarantine that, right? Let's figure out how we can stop this from happening, because that's not good. That's using operational intelligence, understanding the tactics, techniques, and the procedures from UNC 2452 to actually understand what is the attacker going to do next, right? So has there been any suspicious PowerShell commands now that PowerShell has been launched? Let's find that. Are there scheduled tasks? Are there enumeration utilities? What can we tell from this indicator that something bad really happened, and how can we scope out the incident appropriately, which will map back to how quickly we respond to things, right? Do they have evidence of data wiping, artifact destruction, things of that nature? Just, again, you get that intel report from Mandiant that says we've been owned by Solar, or because of SolarWinds we were owned, right? Now let's figure out, okay, let's map out every single step of the way, and let's look for the log data in our SIM to actually see, truly, are we compromised by this as well? So in the example of my colleague who was quarantined within 10 minutes of VirusTotal, that domain, probably need to do more. If they followed this, they might have actually realized that, hey, this is just a client using VirusTotal, it's not a big deal. But I do give them a grain of salt with that because, again, holiday season, all these detections firing, world's on fire, SolarWinds was owned, it's not good. So I get it. So, I mean, it was resolved within 20 minutes or so, it's not a big deal. But it just goes to show you that, like, if that was actually something that wasn't a client, maybe it had actually some sort of, I don't know, OT capacity next to it, or some sort of more important thing than just my colleague's computer. That could be catastrophic, that kind of response time, right? So I told you we wouldn't let leadership off the hook here. We're going to talk about leadership actually. So we talked a lot about the low-level stuff, the analyst work, the SOC work that we would do. Let's talk about leadership, right? They're not safe from this. So in the very top of that whole circle is the planning and direction phase. So leadership needs to understand from a high level, how does intel get leveraged and what makes good intel? And how do I know that I'm listening to the people who are actually leveraging it? And then also talking to the vendor to make sure we have a perfect, harmonized, actual feedback loop. So I had another colleague who was working an RFP, request for proposal, for a vendor. They were saying this vendor wanted to purchase some sort of intel subscription. They were taking bids from other clients, right, other vendors. And the decision maker there that was asking for that RFP said, I want 50,000 indicators a month. That was their main component of requirement, along with pricing, along with integrations within their product. But they were saying, I want 50,000 a month, and if you can't provide me that, don't send me an RFP. And my friend and I, we chuckled at that because clearly there's an issue, or not clearly, more than likely, there's going to be an issue at the very top where whoever this decision maker is just thinks in sheer numbers. If I have 50,000, I'm good. But what if those 50,000 are, bad, right? If I'm in the hospitality industry and I care about POS systems being breached and I care about vulnerabilities related to POS systems, if 20,000 of those 50,000 indicators are for biomed devices, now I just cut my intelligence by 40%. Right? So now I'm only leveraging 60% capacity of my threat intelligence just because I just asked, I don't care what you give me, just give me 50,000 indicators, right? Not good. So let's actually have those conversations and make sure management at the higher level understands what we need to do and what the goals are of the security organization to actually, progress and up our security posture. So leadership needs to be aware of the time and effort also. One thing I always point out is I worked for an organization that had a whole entire threat intel group dedicated to just consuming it, reading the news, consuming it, and socializing that to the the SOC team, and actually just giving us a list of here's a bunch of bad, now go find stuff. Now that's an issue because I don't have time for that. I got to worry about phishing. I got to worry about the Azure portal. I got to worry about Splunk. I have 5 different portals to work out of. How do I action all these alerts and still hunt, right? There's dedicated resources that need to do that to properly hunt something. I gave the example when we looked at hashes earlier, where if I have a single hash that fires, does that mean bad? Not necessarily. I need to actually triage it and find out, well, what is it firing on? Why is it firing? What processes are kind of wrapped around that hash? Things of that nature. You need to use context, right? And organizations that have dedicated resources to this are great at it, but not everybody does. So they might just get a new intel report and say, hey, FireEye just pushed out the SolarWinds report. Now go hunt. And of course we will, because that's what we're here to do, and that's a high-profile situation. But to properly triage all those alerts, it takes a lot of cycles, which is why you sometimes need dedicated resources to consume the intel and then also to hunt with that intel. So we go back to UNC 2452, right? Okay, we have some sort of beaconing activity, but if an analyst is working all these other alerts, they're not really going to triage it appropriately, and we have situations where my friend gets quarantined, right? So do we have a process to actually sift through the data that Mandiant FireEye pushed out? I keep saying FireEye, Mandiant pushed out. Do we have actual processes to sift through it and see if it is applicable to us? We need to have that step in the beginning. And you know who enables that is leadership. Leadership needs to actually have processes in place or request processes be made to actually sift through the data and find noteworthy activity for us to actually hunt. And also time. If each hunt takes an hour and there's only 4 SOC analysts that are actually using the intel and hunting, if I have 20 hits, that's 20 hours for one single analyst to hunt down every single bit of that hit on a hash or a malicious IP address or whatever. So we need time to actually do this. And if management doesn't give you enough time, then now we have issues with, I'm just going to quarantine this guy's box, and when he responds in a ticket, we'll figure it out later, right? That's not the best way to do it. We need to actually allocate time to actually do this stuff. So in conclusion, right? Threat intel, we talked about what that is. It's just information gathered to kind of formulate a theory about what an attacker will do, what they're leveraging, concepts and motives that they actually take. IOCs are just artifacts, just things that happen that indicate a computer intrusion of some sort, IP addresses, domain names, things of that nature. If you don't take away anything from this, the main thing I want you to take away is context. Anything in life in general, right? But anything when it comes to context and threat intel, super important. If you get a hit, let's figure out why. Is this normal? Are we using this vendor? Or is there a vendor vulnerability? Whatever it might be, let's derive more value out of this intel and not just quarantine boxes, right? So let's also, one thing you can do, hopefully when you get your organization tomorrow, is let's fix the life cycle. Again, create a forum. Just have some sort of feedback, communication with your team, your SOC lead, your intel analyst, your vendor even, and just say, hey, this intel was either good or bad. Even good feedback is good, right? Maybe that helps them, I don't know, makes better intel or something. But either way, you need to have some sort of feedback loop. So let's close that gap, right? And let's also analyze the actual intel we're getting. Let's not just assume because a vendor said it, then we're good, right? If I have one of my clients' IP addresses in a context table for a ransomware or coin mining, let's make sure that that's actually useful and not just some generic, they put us in some Shopify IP address that has thousands of clients. We don't want that in our intel subscription. So provide that feedback, and also leadership is extremely important with this. Again, don't want to leave leadership off the hook. They facilitate that process. They, they enable analysts to actually do what they need to do and do it appropriately and fully scope out an incident and make sure we get end-to-end resolution for whatever that indicator or alert is. So with that, are there any questions? Yes.
Typically, how long is your engagement with clients when you're trying to build out these programs?
So it can vary. When it comes to something like small, just like a SIM implementation, it can be a month, 2 weeks to a month. But if we're talking, real scoping and actually making sure the security posture goes from level 1 to level 3, maturity or whatever it might be, that can be year, 2 year, 3 year with constant renewals, right? So it just depends. But these small, relatively small projects, insider threat development, things like that, 1 week, 2 week engagements. So.
What's the time before they see ROI?
Yeah. So on a which program? On any of them? I think it's pretty apparent pretty quickly because we'll go in and ask the questions that need to be asked, and they'll immediately throw their hands up I don't have that. I don't have your documents you need. And we're like, okay, make it. We'll wait. You're going to pay us, but we'll wait, right? So now we're waiting for you to build out what you need. So now within a week or so, the teams internally at that client have developed what they need to give it to us. So they already have tangible output from our engagement. So it's pretty quick. Now in regards to the fidelity of some of the alerts or whatever it might be, it always varies. That's pretty hard to judge. It always varies. But Just for the sake of Mandiant, it's always 100%. So, yeah. And again, I need to point out, actually, I forgot to do that. This is not Mandiant. This is me, by the way, just FYI. Yeah, go ahead.
I think it depends on who you ask, which company, vendor, product, solution has the best intel. Intel threads included.
Mm-hmm.
And I know a lot of organizations, they just utilize what threat intel is included in those solutions that they own.
Right.
Would you recommend that aside from the threat intel that's included in the solutions that they own,
Mm-hmm.
to go out and look at purchasing, independent threat intel subscriptions as well?
I would absolutely encourage that. So with the initial, right, we talked about the life cycle, let's analyze what we're actually getting to make sure it's useful. And if it is, then we can call it a day. We can just leverage what's baked in, right? But if we're not doing that and we just want to make an assumption that maybe it's not the best, then let's talk to those vendors. Let's have those conversations. I mean, what's the worst that can happen, right? We have that conversation. All vendors will have some sort of cheat sheet that says, according to this cheat sheet, we do this better than X vendor. They have it mapped out relatively quickly, so they can give you answers like, well, we provide 50,000 indicators, or we will have constant biweekly meetings with you, or whatever it might be, right? We can have those conversations. So it's always worthwhile to do that, just to say, hey, what else is out there, right? You don't want to just assume you're covered. Let's see what else is out there. So I think it's important to have those conversations, for sure. For sure. Anybody else? Yes.
Give an opinion on shelf life of content.
So the question is, I probably should repeat the question, but so the question is, do I have an opinion on the shelf life of atomic IOCs? Not a steadfast sand and the line in the ground kind of opinion, right? But I would say within a month, 2 months, let's say 2 months. I'll go with 2 months. Within 2 months, if I have an IPv4 address hit, kind of sketch. If I have an email address hit, maybe I'll give it 4 months or so, depending on what the email address is. But a lot of this stuff, you can do quick lookups to actually automate that process, right? So you can look up to see, is this domain still serving pages back? Am I getting an index domain response? Don't really care about that. Let's move on, right? So you can, for me, I would say 2 months, depending on what the intel is, of course. But you can also just automate some of that and actually do it through automation and verify yourself. So yeah, good question though. Anybody else? All right, that is it. Thank you.